This is the first, thank you. I'll speak about that in a moment. This is the first of 3 webinars on this topic. We're really grateful to the National Institute of Standards and Technology, or NIST, for the funding that has supported this series. Today, we're going to introduce the topic of data access and discuss the what and the why of it. Our second webinar in August will begin answering the question of how, with a more detailed look at how data sharing is managed and implemented. And then the third webinar will focus a little bit more on how, less on the technical aspect, but more on the policies and the regulatory strategies that facilitate successful data sharing. We will also be producing a companion resource for each of these 3 webinars, and that will be posted on the website along with a recording of the core material of this presentation and any of the presentation files. We'll note that we will not be recording and posting the Q&A and the breakout discussions. That's for us and for your use and edification here. We want you to feel free to ask questions and offer your thoughts and perspectives with your peers and with your experts. We have also limited these webinars only to state agency staff. That's our members within NARUC at the Public Utility Commissions. I think we also have some of our friends from NASIO, the energy offices, and NSUCA, the consumer advocates, who are joining us and whose participation we really value in these and many other things. You can visit CPI's webpage for a full calendar of our events, including the next 2 upcoming webinars, where you can register for those if you haven't already. And we hope you will return for those in August and in September. This is our agenda for this afternoon. I've already covered the overview. In a moment, I will turn it over to Commissioner Paradis for some opening remarks and context setting. And then we're going to have a presentation from our 3 experts. They're each going to cover different aspects of data sharing and some use cases that cover different customer types and data types and objectives. They're going to use a bit of an integrated approach. And so they're not necessarily just going to go in order and have their own slides. There'll be a little bit of handing off, but we think it'll flow smoothly because it puts the content in the order that we think makes most sense for you. Our experts today are Nikhil Balakumar from Eclipse. He's the founder and CEO of that organization. We have Colleen Morris, the CEO of Calico Energy, and we have Kelly Crandall from UtilityAPI, where she's Vice President of Regulatory Policy and also a former member of NARUC from her time working at the Colorado Commission. After the presentations, we'll have a brief window for any real high-level clarifying questions to the whole group, but really the meat of the discussion will happen in technical assistance sessions, and I'll speak more about that later, about the details of that, but you'll be able to, each of the 3 experts will be in their own breakout room, and you'll be able to visit them and share your questions with them and the others in that room and have a discussion there about things that are specific to you and your jurisdiction. You're really encouraged to ask those questions. That's why we're providing the time for that, so that you can ask stuff that's really pertinent to you and your own situation. We also hope there's time and sufficient time for you to visit more than one expert. If based on what you've heard them each talk about, you want to ask different questions of different experts. Each of those rooms will be facilitated by a NARUC staff person, myself, or one of my colleagues, Danielle Sass-Burnett or Marjorie Snyder. I think we should have at least 30 minutes for that, so plenty of time. And then at the very end, we'll come back together as a group and for any last thoughts from the experts and some key takeaways. Other housekeeping. We are in Zoom meetings, so I believe that means each of you can control your own camera and microphone. Please do keep yourself on mute to limit any background noise. But particularly in the breakout rooms, if you want to come on camera and participate kind of in that more peer-to-peer way, please do. If you have any technical difficulties, please use the chat to reach myself or the co-hosts. When we do the Q&A, brief Q&A with the whole group, please use the Q&A feature, and I'll remind you of that when we get to that. That all said, I will hand the virtual microphone over to Commissioner Paradis for some opening remarks, and then we will get into the expert presentation. Commissioner?
Great. Thank you, Jeff. That's what I was looking for. So first of all, I want to thank everybody for being here today. This is a really important issue, and this is a very nuanced and detailed issue, why it's going to take 3 webinars for us to go through it today. And I really want to put my thanks out to Colleen and Nikhil and Kelly and Jeff. They have spent all of last week, including the holiday, putting together and curating this presentation today to really walk through, as Jeff said, really make this as easy and digestible as possible. As we all know, I never introduced myself. I'm Stacey Paradis, by the way, from the Illinois Commerce Commission. I've been on the commission a little over 2 years. But prior to this, I was in the energy efficiency industry, which means I was one of these little dots here on the outcomes of the data sources that we're looking for. And what you're going to see today and why this is so important and so important to us on the regulatory side is when we talk about implementation of policy, when we talk about achieving goals, data means different things to different people, and we're talking about different pieces of data. Yes, it's the customer data, but how we slice and dice it, what pieces of it, how it's being combined or separated, how we're sharing that, all of those things are going to be very important and some of the different challenges that come before us. And then on the regulatory side, the other piece that comes before us is how then we work with our utilities to get that data. There's going to be questions about data access. There's going to be questions about software. There's going to be question of how do you aggregate it? How do you autonomize it? All of those different things. So I'm really excited for the different discussions that we're going to have today. And they've really put together some thought on the various use cases to walk through all of these questions about what data are we talking about and how are we going to access it. And then the last thing, just to follow up with what Jeff said, if you have high level questions as we go through this first set of presentations, please go ahead and put those in the chat and we'll answer those prior to going to the breakout rooms today. But with that, as you can see in front of you, this is what I was trying to say verbally, and kind of we talk about customer data, then we need to understand what platform it's going through, all the different users and all the different outcomes. So this is a multifaceted issue, and I'm really excited for the discussion today. So with that, I believe, Nikhil, you're our first speaker.
Thank you, Commissioner. Hi, all. For those who don't know me, my name is Nikhil Balakumar with Eclipse. A little bit about Eclipse. We're a consulting firm that works with generally state commissions, agencies, and NGOs on the regulatory side on a whole host of grid mod issues, including data access. So just jumping right into it, the commissioner alluded to several different things, including a broad set of stakeholders who need access to data, the importance of how that data is made available. But we thought before really diving into those issues, it'd be important to really first focus on what do we actually mean by customer data, and what exactly does that entail? So this table you see before you, I work pretty deeply in Illinois on behalf of a group of NGOs, and so we actually co-developed a whole set of data requirements with Commonwealth Edison in Chicago around their data platform initiative. And so this table before you here was really the sort of different customer data types we identified that a broad set of stakeholders needed. So as we go through these, I think it's important for folks to not only view these data types as individual data types, but as a collective set of data that's needed. As we go through the use cases in the upcoming slides, I think what you'll start to see is that third parties and stakeholders more broadly generally need or use multiple data types here, and the general reason for that is this is all around individual customer data, and the idea here is third parties really want to understand how can we get a full picture, a complete picture of the customer, so we can give them the most insightful, useful recommendations on potential solutions. And those customers in turn have the best recommendations to decide, what is best for them. So diving right into it, I want to start with the first two, which are raw meter usage data and billing quality usage data. We talk about these together because they do come from the same data source, which is ultimately the meter. And so these data types are essentially the same types of data, but at different stages in the collection process. And so raw meter data is literally the data collected right off the meter and into the utility systems. There is a process called VEE, validation, editing, and estimation, through which essentially utilities take this raw meter data and clean it up, verify it, make sure it's accurate, and then that turns into billing data. And the reason for this process is, utilities want to be very confident that the data they're using to bill you is accurate. And so raw meter data is really, that first round of data you're getting from the meter, and billing data is raw meter data once all of that is cleaned up. Now you may be wondering, why we've separated these, and why do you need both of these? We'll get into this a little later, but just as a quick example, we have DERs participating in wholesale markets right now, and the one thing we do know is you get raw meter data faster. The utility gets that data faster. It takes some time to clean and process it before they can use it for billing. So depending on different ISO settlement requirements, raw meter data may be more useful because you get that faster, and you could use billing data later for settlements. So jumping right into the next one, billing data. So this is literally the information on your bill. And so, as a third party, you may want to know, what was your bill last month? What was it the past year? What was it the past couple of years? And so this, in a literal sense, gives you all the information that you would get on your bill as a customer. And finally, customer and account info. So this, this includes, your account number. This may include your feeder ID. This could also include the rates and tariffs that you're on. But the idea collectively, these data types, is to give you the complete and fullest picture of the customer, so you can make the best recommendations to them. I'll hand it off to you, Colleen.
Next slide, please. Thanks, Nikhil. I'm Colleen Morris, CEO of Calico. Our interaction with this problem set and the sort of position that I'm speaking from is helping utilities organize data into buildings and deliver that. So this slide here is really a visual representation of what the world looks like for utilities, starting from the meters at the bottom, mapping upwards to blue and green people, which in this code, we're using blue for residential customers and green for commercial customers. The buildings that those people may be bill paying customers within. And then if there's a different building owner, a sort of landlord or a property owner, that is what we call the purple people on this slide. And so we wanted to kind of contextualize this conversation about a lot of the different types of data at a single customer level that Nikhil just articulated, by also explaining how the utility business model, which is really built on meters and customers, relates to the buildings that a lot of those customers inhabit. So it's just important to understand that when you're talking about meter data, even for like a single commercial tenant in a single tenant building, like this little green, let's call that a freestanding hair salon on the far right, there are often multiple meters associated with a customer. So the sort of act of extricating data from utility systems often means combining multiple sets of data, either to the customer level or, and we'll talk quite a bit about this later, from the customer level up to the building level. So I think we wanted to pull this slide forward, and I'll also just say that there's some iconography here that you'll see on some of the use case slides later. So we're going to revisit this structure a bit. And I think we're good for next slide. One other sort of table setting context conversation is there are a couple of specific A words that are very relevant to lots of different data access conversations. The first of those being aggregated, and the second here being anonymized. I've also heard other words like bulk. And I think the real most important takeaway from this slide is that every one of us on this call has seen these terms used with varying definitions and sometimes interchangeably. And in any conversation about data access, I think starting with a common overly articulated definition is really important. So for our purposes today, and in general, what we believe is best practice is that if you're talking about aggregating data, you really are combining and flattening data from many to something to a one, like in the example of flattening customer data to a building level, whole building data set. And anonymized data is really the idea of de-identifying or making that data non-specific to individual customers, but generally it's still the complete resolution or a larger data set. So that's how we're using these terms. And the real takeaway is that none of us should probably trust them when we hear them, and that we should always define and make sure that everybody is kind of using them the same way. Even this week, I've seen them defined different ways in different contexts. Next slide, please. I think this is coming back your way, Nikhil.
Yep. Thanks, Colleen. Yeah, so for folks' context, we have laid out 6 different use cases on how customer data is used. So I'll cover the first 2, Kelly will cover the next 2, and then Colleen will cover the last 2. So the first use case we wanted to go through wanted to focus on the individual customer, and specifically the use case of sizing a residential DER system. And so just to kind of give you an example of, we talked about the different, potential individual data types that are used. In this case, a DER company would need a couple of different data types. They would need billing quality usage data, sort of general billing data, including, your historical bills, as well as your rate and tariff, as well as your account info. To give you a sense of how this data is used, there's several different ways this could be used. So for billing data, what's literally on your bill? Developers typically need to know, what are you paying every year? What are you paying monthly? So they can kind of understand, what sort of system can they build, whether your goal is to offset your entire bill or part of your bill. And so just that, core billing data is pretty important. In terms of like the billing quality usage data, and when we're talking about usage data, we're talking about, if a developer wants, a year of historical usage data, that data would essentially, provide every day's usage at at intervals from anywhere from 15 minutes to 30 minutes to an hour. And this granularity is important because, for developers, they want to understand, your sort of seasonal usage and, your peak load impacts, especially as we, evolve from standalone solar systems to solar plus storage, figuring out the size of that storage and the dispatch schedules and the impact of that interval usage data, that granularity throughout the year is really important. Finally, on the rate and tariff information, it's important to know what rate and tariff you're on. I mean, there could be very specific DER related tariffs. There could be TOU rates. And so it's important to understand what you're on now to inform what you could potentially switch to. Next slide, please. So the second use case really builds off the first one, which is, once you have DERs in place, how would you get them enrolled into a program? And so in this case, the example we picked was a vehicle to grid program implementer. And so one of the goals of, a V2G program implementer could be to enroll you in a TOU rate. And so in this case, if I'm a V2G implementer coming to a customer, there's kind of several different stages here. It's one, you need to convince a customer that a TOU rate is beneficial for them. And so in that case, this is where you really need that interval usage data to kind of model out, you're on your current rate, what would your bill be? If you're on a TOU rate and you actually adhered to those time periods and adjusted your energy use, what could your bill be? And so that's, having that usage data is really important to model that for the customer and to ultimately enroll them. The other piece here, similar to what I'd mentioned before, but it's particularly important here if you're changing someone's rate or tariff, is that rate and tariff information. So if you're on a standard, flat rate, we need to know that. So we can understand, we can go pull those rates, we can pull the distribution charges, we can do that modeling and ultimately compare it to something like a TOU rate, which is why you would need both those types of information. And now I'll hand it off to Kelly for the next use case.
Hi, everyone. I'm Kelly Crandall, VP of Regulatory for UtilityAPI. And just brief background, UtilityAPI is a software company that integrates directly with utilities and provides secure, standardized transmission of a lot of this core data, energy and account data to third parties on customers' behalf and with their permission. So this use case number 3 really builds on what Nikhil was talking about. This is a DER aggregation example. There's a recent report that came out from North Carolina Clean Energy Technology Center and SEPA that suggests that about 40 states are working on various aspects of virtual power plant programs and distributed energy resource aggregation, with drivers ranging from their own state legislation to Order 2222 to just high load growth generally, contributing to the need for flexibility to reduce or shift how peaks are working. And data sharing around these concepts of program eligibility, enrollment, and settlement is a pretty foundational component of scaling up virtual power plants. It's even been built into enabling legislation in states like Virginia. And so as a VPP aggregator, as an entity that is acting as a third party and bringing on these customers in order to react to demand signals, they need a lot of information from multiple directions and sources. From the customer side, there's the need to be able to obtain interval data and program eligibility information, like whether the customer is on a particular tariff, so that they can assess customer benefits from it for enrolling, similar to what Nikhil was talking about. This can allow calculation of an upfront rebate stacking, that sort of thing. And that process needs to be easy and to cover customers pretty comprehensively because of the volume of potential customers that might need to be enrolled through virtual power plants. Aggregators also need the ability to access interval billing quality data on an ongoing basis from utilities to be able to compare that baselines against customer actual performance. And especially where you have a virtual power plant program that's designed around a pay for performance concept, or is a DER aggregation that has obligations in the wholesale market. There can sometimes be the need for more of the real-time raw data, which could help with customer decision-making during DR events. And as we're going to discuss this throughout a lot of the use cases, but just getting this in a standard format that can be quickly reviewed and processed is absolutely essential and promotes more auditability for regulators across all of these programs. And next slide. The next use case we wanted to share is commercial facilities management. This is a pretty big use case. I come from a local government background, and there were cities and counties with hundreds of facilities that are looking for their data to be presented in a usable format. So historically, you might have a big box store that has retail locations and distribution centers, maybe across several states. They're located across the entire West. And their accounting team is receiving bill PDFs that have different levels of data, different formats for data. They're coming from different utilities. I can tell you just personally that bill comparison isn't easy, even just comparing my residential bill in Colorado to my sister's bill in Maryland to try to help her decide if she was enrolling in a program. It was not a super intuitive process. Now, one of the tools that has come about to try to manage this sort of thing, where you have basically a single customer that's wanting a lot of different premises across jurisdictions, is electronic data interchange. And we'll talk a bit more about standards later, but this is used across a lot of industries, including healthcare. And it starts to standardize the format for data transmission, but it can still be configured in ways that are utility and market specific, which is why you may more often hear green button as a standard for downloading or electronically transferring data, where it has more prescribed categories of data that can be used regardless of your utility or state. And what we're seeing in this use case is that you have these large customers that want all of their data across premises compiled into more of a single spreadsheet type document so that they can, for example, prioritize the highest energy users, look at interval data and consider switching rates in with certain utilities, doing a range of different kinds of analysis so that they can understand energy management, the impact of potential rate changes and things like that. And while this is often a pretty sophisticated set of customers, they are still looking for efficiencies in how data is transferred that prevent them from having to do manual entry, that make it easier for, say, the accounting team and the facilities management or energy management team to work together, that sort of thing, and really leverage electronic data transfer. And this has some similarities to what Colleen's going to be discussing with whole building data, as like a lot of these facilities managers may have individual buildings that have multiple meters that need to be aggregated. So I want to transfer to Colleen to do the next set of use cases.
Okay, I told you we would come back to this slide. So just to kind of revisit this structural dynamic, I mean, everything that Nikhil and Kelly just articulated is applicable at the building level. You know, we're talking about putting DERs out there in the right places where they make sense, the idea of grid interactivity, you know, using building level technology for load management in the context of a VPP, and like Kelly mentioned, property owners of multiple locations of properties all over. The nuance that I'm adding with a couple of these additional use cases is that for about 3/4 of the big buildings that utilities are serving, particularly for electricity, there are multiple tenants, multiple bill paying customers in the building. And so when you add that wrinkle, in order for those technologies and those programmatic opportunities to be available to larger buildings, both the buildings themselves and I would argue the utilities need to be able to see what's happening at the building level. So that additional layer of aggregation and the sort of introduction of my friend, the purple person, becomes relevant for these last couple of use cases where, you know, the tenants in a building, the blue and green people here, are themselves often participants in utility programming and could be engaging with different rates and different utility opportunities. And also, if there's a purple person, they are a different and added relationship dimension, just like the building is, particularly these three building types in the middle, where you clearly have multiple customers in a building. I always say solar doesn't go on the wall in a living room like a smart thermostat does. So I think that is part of how I would just kind of frame these next two use cases. Next slide, please. So the first of those use cases is a multifamily property. So this property is owned by a purple person, inhabited by many blue people. You know, we have a pretty wide range of property owners, particularly in this segment where you may have like very large multifamily portfolio owners, like, you know, Greystar and Wind, just to name a few. And you also often have folks who own one or two or three smaller multifamily properties, or they're just regionally or locally property owners. There's a very wide range of sophistication in property ownership of this building type. Certainly, there are also different demographics within this typology, like we certainly see HUD and HUD owned and HUD participating properties, affordable housing in general. And usually the goals for this type of building start at least with baselining for the purpose of benchmarking. That is not just because of a law or an ordinance directing them to benchmark. There is a lot of potential funding, and this has been true regardless of federal programs and federal dollars more recently, but for many, many years, Fannie and Freddie, for instance, have required multifamily properties benchmark to access a lot of the lending that's available to them. So when we talk about compliance and access to funding, those are some of the drivers that really mobilize this use case. Definitely also program participation, both in utility programs and state programs. A lot of that, as many of you know, is related to capturing monthly data. So this is historic monthly usage data at the building level. That's kind of the bare minimum. I've seen utilities deliver this data from like billing source data and from meter source data. You know, how you create the data set can vary a little bit, but ultimately you're looking for a historical monthly usage data. And generally the industry standard right now for benchmarking is the EPA's Energy Star Portfolio Manager tool. But the need for that sort of baseline building level data is really first. And then what happens with it, whether that's benchmarking and how it's benchmarked, is what follows. So if we move to the next use case, I'm gonna do what Kelly did. We didn't even plan this, but I'm gonna like link directly back to her use case number 4 and say, everything Kelly said about that slide in terms of program participation and the drivers for a like large property owner of multiple properties, everything applies as far as the technologies and the engagement, and often the sort of sophistication of large portfolio owners of many of these big mixed use or wholly commercial properties. In this case, though, they're not getting a bill for the whole building. So, you know, this is really just that you have property owners with the largest property owners in the US who are, you know, across all jurisdictions, often own a property type. That means, as I mentioned, particularly for electricity, that they're not the ones paying the bills. So for them to access the data that they want, that can be compliance driven, it can be benchmarking and building performance standards. It's often quite a bit more than that for this profile. So there are often investor requirements for ESG reporting. This group is very sophisticated in terms of their own sort of tooling and analysis. And a lot of that is based on operating income management and investment management. They're the folks that are absolutely looking to engage in additional incentives and, you know, play with some of these programs that are monetizable in a number of different ways. It's just extra hard for them to benchmark or get that baseline data from utilities right now. So many of them spend a lot of money getting it for themselves and capturing it for themselves. So this is also the area where there's, as Nikhil articulated at the beginning, as we move down that spectrum of like resolution of data, you know, building level loads would be immensely valued. In fact, this data recipient is generally investing a lot in getting that data other ways. And so there's a significant amount of interest in higher resolution building level data from some of these sophisticated commercial real estate owners. I think we're moving on to the next slide now. Thank you.
And I'll pick back up here. We wanted to spend the meat of our discussion talking about these different use cases, but we did want to just frame up a couple of issues on how to make this data sharing of these use cases more meaningful. And this is going to be explored a lot more in NERC's future webinars. And as I'm talking about this, please do feel free, put in Q&A, put in the chat. We're looking forward to discussing with you more what your questions are. So this slide is a lot of content, but I will orient you to what it's intended to show, which is we have a top layer of data users and owners. We have a middle layer of software, and we have a bottom layer of utility systems that authenticate and source data. And so just starting at the top left and going down to the bottom and then back up to the top right, I'll explain a little bit about what this is intended to show. So it starts with the customer approving the access to data in the top right. They're going through, or sorry, in the top left, they're going through a utility web portal or something along those lines to demonstrate that they are who they say they are and give the utility information it can check against its systems. Moving down into the bottom, the utility is then doing that authentication. It's pulling information associated with that customer from its systems. And the things that we were talking about earlier that Nikhil presented at the beginning, billing data, customer account data, could be coming from several different utility systems, ranging from a meter data management system to customer relationship management or some other kind of customer billing or information system. And then that data is pulled up through this software retrieval process for the third party. And this layer of software kind of creates that interface for the third party and puts it in a standardized format. And it also creates this layer of abstraction so that the utility doesn't have to interact and integrate with every single different third party that's looking for data. And so it, creates a system where the customer can manage access, the third party can look at multiple customers' data, and the utility is being pinged to provide this data on the back end. So there's a lot of nuances to this. It does involve a lot of work on data security and privacy. But this is kind of intended to show just all the pieces that have to come together to make what we're talking about really work. And the next slide. We did want to share a little bit of foundational actions, and I'll ask my colleagues to step in and add to this if there's anything you want to add. I think we've seen some similar things over the years. I know I've heard a lot of complaints about, data sharing systems are not being used by customers and third parties. And I think that can be true in some instances, right? They're not easy to find. They don't necessarily have wide coverage across customers, which can make it difficult for a third party to determine if they should use that system versus calling the customer and getting a bill PDF and going through a much more manual process. But in our experience, there are some things that make it much more likely that the data sharing system is going to work and it is going to be actively used and not just used for some basic purposes, but it could be used for a lot of different data transmission opportunities. And the first is standard data formatting. Historically, there's been this push to have data in standard formats, moving into electronic data interchange, and then more recently, the Green Button Connect over the last more than a decade now. And those formats are important. They can often live side by side. They create consistency for customers and for third parties who could be pulling in data from a lot of different states and utilities. But they are only part of the equation. For example, they don't, they might explain how to determine at what level of granularity you're presenting a kilowatt hour to what decimal, but it doesn't necessarily explain like how to create a user interface that's really workable. So a couple of other big lessons learned are that you really need a process of customer authorization that's clear and efficient, and it's not buried in multiple steps or legalistic language. You also have to have a good process for setting up and registering third parties. Say you have a multi-state solar developer who has several staff working on proposals for individual customers. You want the company to be able to get set up so that it can agree to all the security that it needs to agree to, but it can also manage its own staff and make sure they have access to the information they need. And this is, we call this account provisioning, and I expect it's going to come up a lot more in the next webinar on consent. And just the last item I'll flag is application programming interfaces or APIs. So this is about how different software systems communicate with each other and request and return information in certain formats. And so they make it a lot easier for these standardized connections to occur between systems. So you're not always having to have a very unique way of connecting software. And so it just really creates a more prominent security and efficiency tool for a lot of vendors to use.
So I'll kick us off with the first emerging opportunity, and then I'll hand it off to Colleen. So over the past, I guess I would say 5 years or so, there's been a shift, across the country towards, exploring the value of potentially like multi-utility, data sharing platforms, which, typically have been focused on statewide platforms and are now more recently thinking about regional platforms. And the reason behind this is because, during the first wave of AMI deployments and during the first wave of, solutions that were built to provide access to customer data, there was an unlimited amount of bespoke individual solutions. We already, especially as third parties and market participants, they're typically operating state by state, and every state has its own rules and requirements. But on top of that, if you're trying to, get access to data, you're not only building systems that have different requirements per state, but have different requirements per utility. And so a lot of the best practices Kelly mentioned around data formats, the authorization process, how are you provisioned for third parties, like how you get the data, whether it's an API or a downloadable spreadsheet. Every single utility in every single state is entirely different. And this just creates, significant barriers to entry and potentially significant costs for third parties to build bespoke solutions for all these different areas. And so, one of the value propositions around moving towards, a statewide or a regional, platform is, we are standardizing all these requirements so that, as a third party comes into a state or a region, it's, they're getting the same data formats, it's the same process, it's all streamlined in one way, at least state by state. The other piece here, which is also emerging across several states, is not just focusing on electric customer data, but also gas data for electrification opportunities. Even beyond that, there's several platforms, in the examples in the final bullet that are going beyond customer data, that are also sharing system data and rates and tariff information, which is a much broader universe where stakeholders are using all those different data types together. Just to give you a sense of kind of where these platforms are at, Texas goes back more than 5 years. They are probably the most long-standing platform. It is a statewide platform that provides access to customer data. New York is currently building their platform, which is intended to provide access to customer data, system data, rates, and tariffs. California, through the CEC, is working towards a statewide rate tool. New Hampshire is in the midst of procuring a platform. The Massachusetts utilities were recently legislatively mandated to do a statewide customer data platform. And finally, in Illinois, I'd mentioned the ComEd data requirements a couple slides ago, but Ameren, Illinois also has data requirements. And so there's been some exploration of, does a statewide approach make sense? The final piece I'll leave you with here is, as we move, this is all about standardization. And so, just one interesting tidbit, just Illinois specific, is, ComEd has, been one of the first utilities to acknowledge this lack of standardization and the need to move towards some more national standards. And so that is something, we're starting to be working on this fall in Illinois. Over to you, Colleen.
Thanks. I think the origin stories of the examples that Nikhil just went through are quite varied. Some of those are a product of legislative, they are a hypothetical product of like a purely legislative action. Most of them are more multidimensional than that. There's like some regulator interacting with others as a part of the process. And I think if I were to zoom out and talk about data access from a legislative perspective, generally, first, I would acknowledge that all the examples we have are fairly unique. It's like still different snowflakes, different places, different drivers. And at the same time, we have started to see some common components to those conversations related to folks really understanding that, if you're walking down this path, there are common drivers and there are common needs, regardless of where the conversation sits at a state level. I would also say that there is a lot to be learned from what has evolved over the past 15 years, specifically in the building-focused energy policy space. For a long time, we had benchmarking laws. Some of those were sort of cities and counties, and then they started to become a state level action, although certainly still cities and counties are producing those. And over time, data access became came into those policies as something that was included because it was a dependency for a benchmarking law or a building performance standard to work. And so in that specific use case, there's a lot of lessons learned and precedent that is very useful to the broader conversation as we're now having a broader conversation about customers accessing their data and data at a higher resolution. There is a fairly well-established set of precedent and standard out there at this point for building level data and building data access in the umbrella of benchmarking and building performance standards, which are generally ordinance or legislative actions, although we certainly have seen some of those be handed from the state legislature to regulatory commissioning bodies. And so I think as I generalize that way and then map it back to our use cases, I would just say that I think we need to continue as an industry finding the common threads where just because one use case and another use case maybe needs slightly different data, the sort of driving umbrella or language or potential legislative guidance really can be common and the same. So I wouldn't want to overly resolve some of these. I feel like we've been playing like policy whack-a-mole a little bit. And now we're realizing that these conversations, while there are important differences in the use cases, there's a lot of sort of common basis in terms of permissioning, security, understanding what the implications are for utilities and like taking a holistic approach to that. And that's what we're starting to see in a lot of the legislative movement over the last maybe 18 months. Kelly?
Yeah, I'll cover cost recovery, which has been interesting to see evolve just a little bit in the last several months since I've come back to the data access world. But historically, a lot of data sharing and data access issues would come up in the context of advanced metering rollouts. And so you have, the metering, that's a capital expense. Data and software associated with it are often operational expenses, and there can be a really long lag time between a plan getting filed, the metering getting rolled out, the software getting tested, and then actually getting implemented for customers. And so I think what you have sometimes seen as a result of that is rollouts that don't always work as well as intended. And there have been some efforts by, there's nuance in a lot of states. One of the examples I can think of where there were some efforts to tweak that approach was the Washington Commission, where there was a decision to withhold some of the prudence associated with cost recovery until certain use cases were demonstrated for advanced metering. And it's not perfect on the data sharing side, but it is, I think, an example of one of the ways that commissions have tried to manage the long duration of these kinds of processes and how long it takes to roll out some of the software and be able to use all the data that comes out of it. There are a couple of more emerging areas, though, that we're seeing. One is hybrid revenue sharing, which is where a portion of the costs of the data system would be paid by the users of that system. And by that, I'm not talking about customers. Generally, customers can own and access and share their own data without a fee. But the third parties that are seeking data might be contributing a portion to offset IT costs. It could be directed to another funding area like bill assistance, that sort of thing. But where I'm seeing that emerging is in areas like consolidated billing for community solar gardens, or sometimes in retail choice states, there's contribution from, a community solar developer to fund the cost of bill consolidation. And so I think there's some analogs in this area as we could see that evolving. And then there's also some emerging models around market transformation for particularly building aggregation, where you can be using building benchmarking as part of demonstrating energy savings. And Colleen, feel free to add to that.
I think you got it. There's some, if anyone's specifically interested in that, these are also all a little bit of, there's definitely some highly detailed information here that we're teasing a little. So please follow up if you have a specific area of interest, and that would be a great example of one. Next slide, I think, which I think is you, Jeff.
Yes, thanks. I was trying to both get my video and audio going and switch the slide. So I just put in the chat, again, we'll take a moment here if there's any highlight, and we did first. Yes, thanks, Jessica. Let's go to Colleen first.
Sure. We had a small but mighty conversation, mostly about some of the other like use cases that we didn't cover. Like we talked some about NARUC's previous deliverable around like grid data and how that relates to some of this and could warrant a re-push in terms of some of that content and brainstorming. Yeah, I would say that was probably, you know, that how that relates to some of the solutions that we talked about today, and those use cases are very different, but like we acknowledged some of the solutioning is pretty similar.
Cool, thanks. Kelly?
Yeah, if I were to boil it down, I would say how we talked about it was how challenging it is to match the level of detail associated with developing data sharing and realizing all of the different, you know, functionalities and pieces and use cases versus the sort of, you know, blocky process of cost recovery and like how there are pros and cons associated with, you know, doing it through rates and riders and things like that. And I think it is a really tricky area.
Great, thanks. Nikhil?
Yeah, yeah, I can close out. I guess, yeah, the big one, and Jeff, this is leading one of your questions, is around data standards and like, you know, what does data standardization look like? How have we done it in the past? And, you know, if we were to take another look at that, you know, how would we do that in the future? I think I would also just flag, you know, there was a mention on sort of residential, low income use cases potentially, and how that could be there. And so that's one we didn't cover, but an important one I think we should consider addressing in future sessions.
Yes, thanks for mentioning that. That was something that I don't think was anticipated in some of the prep for this. We're about out of time. I want to thank everybody for joining us, and I really want to thank the experts. I want to thank Commissioner Paradis for moderating. I want to thank my colleagues, Danielle and Jessica and Marjorie, for their help in putting this together and making it happen, and all the behind the scenes work and in front of the scenes work in the breakout rooms here. So I hope you'll consider joining us for the second and the third. And if you have any thoughts, comments, feedback on this, either on the content or on the format, we would certainly love to hear them. Please feel free to email me, jloiter@naruc.org, or to respond to the NARUC webinars address. I think that would be on your meeting invitation. Reach out. We're always interested to hear from you how we can make sure we meet your needs as closely as possible. Thanks very much. We hope to see you all in August, and maybe we'll see some of you in Boston in a few weeks at our Summer Policy Summit. Take care, everyone.